of the participants, Chris and Colleen, and Eve Fogel, and we're going to start on time and probably finish a little early. So before I invite our moderator and our chair for this session, Bob Greeley, who is a visiting instructor in Arabic and an ABD in geography, and our student chair, Jeff Lee, I want to call the president of Middlebury College to come and say a few words. Please run.
Thank you, Timmy. Very few words, really, this time, I promise. Just would like to add my words of welcome to everyone here. I missed the opening event last evening, which I'm sorry. I heard it was a terrific event. But I do want to thank everyone here, all the presenters and all the participants, and also all the students and faculty who are here. This is perhaps the best of what is done at the college and also at the Rohatyn Center. It's really a remarkable effort to put together, first of all, to identify a topic as central and as important as the future of water on the planet, touching so many areas, the physical sciences, the social sciences, the humanities, and so forth, and really bringing people together from so many different places and also perspectives so that our students really, first and foremost, can learn and really can further their own questioning of many of the issues, many of the practices, many of the things perhaps they never thought about related to something as so central as the quality of water and the availability of water. So hats off to all the organizers, especially to Professor Meyer and all of those who are participating in the symposium. So without further ado, as I promised, a few words, I turn it back over to our presenters and our moderators. Thank you.
Hi. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first Friday session of Politics of Freshwater. My name is Jeff Lee, and I am a senior in environmental studies with a focus on policy. I'll be the student chair for this session, Water Divided. We have an exciting panel ahead of us. Today, today's presentations will revolve around the human impacts on rivers and the implications of different management practices that put into the question what social, economic, and cultural significance these rivers hold for the people. This afternoon, we'll be blessed with 3 presentations. Each presentation will take around 15 minutes. We will take time to exercise our thoughts through a Q&A session after each of the 3 presentations. So I ask that you hold your questions until the end. After the Q&A, we will invite the panelists to making closing remarks, and this panel will finish around 2:30. I'd like to introduce the faculty moderator for this session, professor, instructor, and a recently made friend, Professor Robert Greeley. He is Middlebury's visiting instructor in the Arabic department. He is also a geographer whose work revolves around the issues of environmental governance in the context of development. The first panelist today is Professor Pushpa Iyer from Monterey Institute of International Studies. She specializes in studies regarding identity conflicts, and peace-building processes in post-war societies, especially in South Asia. Her work is especially notable in Gujarat, India, where she has fought for the poor and marginalized communities for an extended period of time. Now here, I'd like to note that from personal experience, she is a great leader in field research. I have been blessed by the opportunity to go with her to Nepal to study post-war societies and research about peace building. And I'm here safely, and she has been a great, great leader. The second panelist we are fortunate to have is T. Scott McMillin from Oberlin College. Professor McMillin is a professor of English and an author of many articles and books. He has written The Meaning of Rivers, Flow and Reflection in American Literature, and Our Preposterous Use of Literature, Emerson, and Nature of Reading. He specializes in finding the meaning of nature within works of literature, much reflecting Middlebury's core environmental studies course, Nature's Meaning. his current work greatly involves the Los Angeles River, which he will be talking about today. And our final speaker in this session is Professor Maria Alessandra Woolson from Middlebury College. She's a visiting professor in the Spanish department. Along with her degree in literature, she has great interest in geography and border studies. Her work focuses primarily on eco-criticism and cultural studies in Latin America. Her multidisciplinary background, she weaves together the worldviews of science and humanities in the areas of sustainability. By doing so, she brings an in-depth cultural aspect of nature and environment to this panel. And without further delay, I would like to invite our first panelist, Pushpa, to spearhead this session. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Jeff, for that introduction. It's really nice to have you chair this session. Brings back lots of memories of our trips together. So I'm going to be talking about what I've titled The Politics of Muddled Waters in Gujarat. I come from Gujarat. I grew up there. And I actually know nothing but water shortage growing up. I remember in the summers we had not more than 2 hours of water. And it was all about a family effort for those 2 hours in the morning on how to store water. Every container in the house was collected. And development for us actually meant we knew better ways of storing water. First, it was about getting private water tanks that we got for an exorbitant sum, of course, to come and deliver. But the fact that we could afford it meant we were more developed. Then we had water tanks within our homes. You know, we would have these prefabricated ones that would go up on the attic, and then we had pipes going through all over the house, you know, into the kitchen, into the bathrooms, and everywhere. And that's how we had water, running water. Then it seemed, okay, that was more of a development. Then came the tube wells and the bore wells, and once they came, then we had 24 hours of water flowing into the house, and we thought, okay, now this is really development. This is what it is. So my interest and my passion for this subject of access to water and the distribution of water in Gujarat comes from this personal experience and not necessarily an academic one. And yet I come from the field of conflict studies, so I've begun to look at water more academically, but from the perspective of seeing how it is a conflict over resources, but also a conflict in terms of social, cultural, and political factors. And Gujarat is a great case study, let me tell you. It's a state in northwestern India, and I need to find a way to go to, yes. Okay, it's a state in northwestern India. It's a dry, semi-arid region with about 2.28% of India's, water resources and 6.39% of the country's geographic area. The state has more than 185 rivers, of which only 8 are perennial, and most of them are located in the central or the southern part. So most of the northern part that you see over here is the one that's the most dry and very drought prone. So more than 34.3% of the total villages of Gujarat are no-source villages, meaning that they have no definite source of water. Surface water availability has gone down, of course, for a variety of reasons. Bad infrastructure management of lakes, our ponds, which we call the talavs, and the tanks, which have all collapsed over a period of time, is one of the primary reasons. And as a result, this reliance on groundwater has increased in the state. In Ahmedabad, which is the commercial capital of Gujarat, which is where I come from, which is right up there, there's about 5 tube wells per square kilometer. That's how bad it is now. So, which goes down on an average to at least 40 meters in depth. And aquifer depletion is, of course, far more rapid than regeneration. My next slide here is the slide which shows the Ran Ki Vav, and I'll explain that in a minute. So, these were some of the more traditional water sources and water distribution mechanisms. So Gujarat is, in the western part, is very well known for the step wells. And these step wells are architectural delights, but let's see them today from the perspective of being both a source of water and a mechanism for distribution of water. Step wells were usually constructed by kings or in both Hindus and Muslims, and the architecture varied depending on who had constructed it. For example, the Hindus would have more, they would have the idols of the gods and goddesses, and the Muslims would not have that. So the step wells were meant for the common people. So you see, it was the idea that the kings and the rulers would actually do something for providing water for their people, to collect water for home use, for bathing, for drinking water purposes. And there's a culture that developed around these step wells. And this culture is a very important part of Gujarat. Knowing the cultural history of Gujarat, you want to know about the step wells. Women, not men, came from all over the area to gather water. And it turned into a place for leisure, and for many traditional customs were centered around these step wells. The religious significance was associated with the gods and goddesses carved around these step wells. And this one, the Ran Ki Vav, is known as the Queen of Step Wells, and it is in Patan. It was built in the 11th century, and I traveled this January to Gujarat, India. I took my students there. We went to Ran Ki Vav, so this picture really comes from our trip just a couple of months ago. And it was buried under the sandstorms over centuries, and it was only excavated in the 20th century, so most of its carvings are intact. It's just absolutely wonderful, to walk down. So as you keep going down the steps, right there, the bottom behind it, or if you see right from the top part of it, right down would be the actual well. So culturally and socially, the step wells were relevant in those time periods, but what stands out is that the gathering of water, it was always a woman's job, and it hasn't changed, right? Certain communities and caste groups were kept out of the step wells. For example, the untouchable caste groups in India, the Dalits as they are known, they are kept out of water sources even today. Or had secondary access, or sometimes they had secondary access for the water in order for them not to be polluted, for the water to be not polluted. The step wells, the British, when they came in, thought the step wells were very unhygienic, and they wanted them to be closed down. So they started constructing the pipes and the other mechanisms by which no longer were these step wells in use. The lack of maintenance completely made these step wells inoperable, and there are so many of these step wells in Gujarat, and none of them are operable. So this next picture over here is the picture of what is called a stepped pond. It's basically, again, as you see, steps, and we visited this one too. And stepped ponds are usually associated to a temple. So this was part of the ruins of an old temple that we visited in the northern part of Gujarat. And again, it is a source of water for drinking and purification purposes, which again meant that certain sections of the population would be left out. Also, again, as you can see, the complete lack of maintenance has made these no longer a source for water. Similarly, ponds and small rivers, tanks, all of which provided a source of water for a variety of purposes, have dried up, left uncared for or abandoned and even destroyed. Now I want to go to, I want to explain this picture. This was in a home that we visited in the olden part of Ahmedabad city. It's now become a tourist site, this particular old home. It's been renovated. But these were the kinds of homes that people had. Sorry, I don't know how to go back. Did I do previous? Yeah. So, these kinds of wells were there in people's homes, and it wasn't a well, it was actually a storage tank for rainwater. So it was very resourceful in terms of how they collected the water inside their homes and then, pumped it up and then used these waters. But again, none of these are operable today. Well, we also saw, sites like this where these ponds were used both for fishing, for washing, for, the cattle to be drinking, for cattle drinking water, etc., and so on. This is also in the northern part of Gujarat. But I want to look more at Gujarat in these contemporary times. And we have to talk about our Chief Minister, Narendra Modi, and in the political context of what he and his government represent. So this is a slogan, right? A new Gujarat within the Gujarat. And what is this new Gujarat that he's talking about? Here, let's begin with the first one, where he says, it's all about a port-led development. Why? Gujarat has a coastline of 1,600 kilometers. It's one of the longest coastlines in the country, as you can see all along where you see the Gulf of Kutch down to the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Khambat. It's all the longest coastline, but it's full of ports, and there's more than 41 ports which make it the entry point to the state and also the exit point. Currently, about 4 of them are privatized. It's been about 15 years since we started this process of privatizing the ports. 4 of them are currently privatized. What does this mean? You know, it's like if you look at the region that says right on top over there, Kutch, you know, in that part of the state, had a major earthquake in 2001. And in 2002, we had large-scale violence against the Muslim communities in the state. And this violence was orchestrated by the state. So you have a systematic effort by the government to bring Kutch, which stood outside. You know, it's a very arid region, culturally very different, socially very different. People, you know, people of Kutch have always retained their identity as separate from that of mainstream Gujarat identity. So you have a systematic process by the state to bring Kutch into mainstream Gujarat. How do you do that? Development. In the name of development, you can actually make sure that this is a region that tends to go in with, say, the vision or the goals of this port-led development. It provides all the infrastructure and all the facilities that you need over there. So Modi's model of development was enforced all along these ports. You know, for example, it's massive industrialization, right? So I was somewhere in the Gulf of Kutch region, and you don't see it on the map over here, in a port called Mundra, which has been privatized. And this was a project that was supported by the World Bank for hydroelectric power. You know, to provide hydroelectric power, there's all these private industries that have come in. And of course, what does that mean? Ecological damage. You know, you have the open cooling systems, which has raised the temperature of the water. You're talking about fishermen, primarily Muslim fishermen, of course, minority community, right, who have been very much affected in terms of their livelihood. You're talking about mangrove forests being destroyed in this area. And, you know, the fight that the civil society was leading to try and stop these industries from coming. It's a losing battle, but I was involved in this project in terms of trying to get the corporate firm and the civil society and the World Bank to have certain conversations. Failed miserably, but that's where, I learned a lot about what was going on all along the coast. And it's rapid industrialization. That's development, you know. The industries are digging more and more bore wells. They're getting deeper. It's gone below 80 meters that these bore wells are going into. The salinity of water is, increased in the area. Local people have no water to drink. They have to buy water, and the water comes from outside, so it's very, very expensive for them. Their agricultural land is destroyed because it's just, soil erosion and everything happening. So that is what Kutch looks like, and it's a systematic plan that is tied to an ideology that this government advocates, a religious nationalist ideology of Hinduism, together with this model of development. So it's in a sense a unique model, bringing in all these different things together, but it has dramatically changed the region. And naturally, the first thing that's affected is water. Now, the second slide, many of you may be familiar with the Narmada Dam project. So the Narmada River is one of our fifth largest river in the country. It starts from Madhya Pradesh, the state of Madhya Pradesh, goes through the north of Maharashtra and comes down into Gujarat. And there are over 3,000 dams that are built over this particular river, of which the Sardar Sarovar, the one you see in the picture over here, is the biggest. Starting at about 80 meters, today it's 121.92 meters, and the Gujarat government is fighting to increase the height to make it to 128 meters. Who's affected in the construction of these dams? Again, the tribals, right? Another minority group that you have to look into, the tribals who are displaced. It's their cultural heritage that was destroyed, their temples, everything that is related to them. It's their livelihood that's gone. And so, again, the whole area has completely changed. So, again, this project was not started by this particular government. It was started much, much earlier. But, of course, this is the government that's pushing for it. And it is, again, here is where people will say that we have created a discourse of scarcity of water. So to the point that we think without the Narmada waters, this state is not going to survive. So if there was no Narmada water, we wouldn't have water to drink. If there was no Narmada water, we would no longer be able to irrigate. And the promise is that the Narmada waters would reach those very northern parts of Gujarat, which are very, very drought prone. In reality, those waters are still not reaching the people. In reality, it is in Ahmedabad city that the water has reached, and who is benefiting from it are the industrialists who are all along the river, and the builders. The builders lobby and the industrialist lobby are the ones that have benefited the most. And maybe well-to-do families, like my family now, has 24 hours of water. Between the borewell and between the Narmada waters, we don't know anymore what is water shortage. Coming from where I came from, it's a huge change when I go back now and see where we are. So that's the model of development, again, at the cost of this tribals. Now, if you see, these were the common sites we saw wherever we traveled in January, whenever we went around to the villages, to the northern part in the rural areas, and there's hardly water trickling through these pumps. Let's see. This is the other project that I want to talk about. Again, not a project that was started necessarily by this particular government, but this is the government that pushed for it, is called the Sabarmati Riverfront Project. Okay, so this is River Sabarmati, right? It comes from Rajasthan, and it's the longest river in Gujarat. Now, Sabarmati dried out at some period of time in the 70s, but the water that you see now is all coming from the Narmada. Okay, so it's from the Narmada Canal. This is what is feeding. The Sabarmati waters was what provided drinking water to the entire city of Ahmedabad. But Ahmedabad grew out of proportion, and no longer did the river serve. So now this is the Narmada water that is coming in. But this particular project is about beautifying the river banks. So it's a riverfront project, right? So all along where you see the concrete pavement, it's about 10.4 kilometers that has been, worked on. So it's been completed just maybe half of what it is supposed to be. But where you see all the concrete and where you see that they're going to, have gardens, and they're going to have small water parks and all, amusement parks and everything else that is going to happen there, has actually displaced people. It has displaced over 70,000 for informal kinds of settlements. Yeah? So you're talking about more than 40,000 people on the banks of the river who were displaced. These were the very poor people. They comprise often 70% of, they're part of the 70% of Ahmedabad city's population that actually works on the streets. So they are now out of the city. They have been moved to a different part of the city, outside of the main city, and their livelihood is gone. They're casual laborers. That's what they did. Lived in the city, worked in the city, and now they live somewhere very far away. Not only do they live very far away, they have built a resettlement for them in this part where we went through it, and there's the road where we are driving. So on our left side is the settlement, which is all Hindus. On the right side is the settlement, which is all Muslims. So not only have you moved them, you have ghettoized them. You just have a road that divides the two populations. So it fits well again with the same religious nationalist ideology that this government is propagating, but again in the name of development, there are so many things happening that is just, we are tired of protesting, but we keep going at this thing. So this is the Ahmedabad city, and this is the kind of Gujarat where we live, and constant challenges in terms of how we have to, work with these situations. Where if you look over here, this is the Muslim displaced people. The people who were displaced with the 2002 violence. This is what their settlement looks like. This is all drainage water that is flowing. That's how they live. These are people on the banks of the river Sabarmati, all the displaced people, but you can see they're still washing their clothes. This is still where they come to get their water. And this is actually literally the banks of the Sabarmati ashram, from where Gandhi preached nonviolence and, respect for people of all religions and all minority communities, including the untouchables. So I think just to conclude, I put down a few different points, most of which I've talked about, so I won't get into it, but I just want to say something very interesting about Gujarat. I think it's the only state in India where when you walk into somebody's house, before even you sit down, someone will offer you water. It's offering water to your guest is one of the most important customs we have. And obviously it's because it's so hot, it makes sense. There is a natural reason for that culture to develop. But I think it's a very, very beautiful custom. You walk in, first thing you have is water. And sometimes even if you don't want it, you must sip it because it's important. That is the respect you show to your host by sipping that water. But in a state where that water is so scarce, look at the customs and the traditions that have developed around water and still continue, The other thing is about sun worship. Every morning you'll find plenty of people, Hindus especially, worshipping the sun. And the way you worship the sun is you feed the sun water. So you take a whole, it's called a lota, but I don't know the English word for it. But basically, like a tall glass that you're actually pouring the water to the sun, right? So again, it's centered around these notions of how important water is for us, geographically with that climate. And yet at the same time, here we are, with all these problems. The cultural factors, social factors, the perceptions, as talked about this, I think it's such a divisive state and it's become more divisive after 2002. In every way, we are divided, whether it's on economics, whether it's on religion, whether it's on culture. And these cultural, social factors are very divisive even today. I mean, it's not just blaming the government. We also have to look at, looking at our own cultural and social factors that say, well, the Dalit should not touch the water, it's going to get polluted, or, only it's the women's job to do it. And there are very interesting programs run by civil society groups like there's an organization, a women's organization called SEVA, and basically what they do is get women to be part of water committees. Water management is a man's job. Water collection is a woman's job. And they wanted to change that, and they said, let's bring women into water management. And it has had positive results in terms of locally managed waters, So there are all different kinds of things that is going on in Gujarat, I think, where, the grassroots, bottom-up approach is probably the most appropriate. But I'll stop there. Jeff showed me a stop sign, so I'll stop. Okay.
Thank you, Timmy, Kat, Charlotte, Dan, anybody else I'm forgetting? It's already been an excellent experience, wonderfully well organized, and a pleasure to be here. For some time now, I have been conducting research in an area that I call textual potamology. I don't think that area actually exists, but that's what I call it. It involves using text to think about rivers and using rivers to think about meaning. And this has led to various kinds of textual treatments of the peculiar fresh waters of the Los Angeles River. And thinking about these strange waters, I hear a strange song in my head. Does anybody know Tom Waits' music? Tom Waits has a song called Misery is the River of the World, and he provides the epigraph for my remarks today. You can drive out nature with a pitchfork, but it always comes roaring back again. The Los Angeles River attracts me precisely because of the strangeness of its waters. Running 51 miles from concrete headwaters through the heart of the most populous county in the U.S., and emptying into the Pacific at its engineered mouth in Long Beach, the LA River has undergone diversion of its flow, widespread clearing of its floodplain, the proliferation of surface paving, and the eventual depletion of underground sources. This led to bringing water to Los Angeles from sources far away, which contributed to a sense that the existing river was no longer much of a river. As its age-old practice of periodic flooding began to have an increasingly catastrophic effect on the burgeoning population of the city, the massive flood control projects of the 20th century made it seem even less like a river, furthering its neglect by residents of and visitors to the greater metropolitan region. Recently, however, activists and local officials have set about politically and in some cases physically re-rivering Los Angeles. In 2010, the EPA declared the river's waters officially navigable, overturning prior declarations to the contrary by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and other governmental entities, thus granting the river and its tributaries protection under the Clean Water Act. In 2011, authorities began issuing permits for weekly canoe and kayak trips down portions of the river. I was invited to serve as an educator on 2 such expeditions, as they're called, near Sepulveda Basin last summer, and I can testify that in many ways the LA River offers a case study of the life, death, and possible rebirth of urban streams. But even this brief history raises questions, particularly the one that titles my remarks. When is a river not a river? The history of human interaction with the LA River, at least from the 19th century on, is a story of overuse, neglect, fear, and control, and a chapter of that story might be said to conclude with the rise of the Los Angeles Flood Control Channel, as the river became known to many in the 20th century. The chapter belongs to a larger story, a way of thinking about the relations between culture and nature, in which those two categories are opposed to one another. In that way of thinking, nature exists as a sometimes seemingly chaotic but overall systematic set of elements, circumstances, and conditions that are subordinated to the needs and technologies of a given culture. But consider the next chapter, which includes the important work of many citizen groups and governmental officials, and resulted in the Los Angeles River Revitalization Master Plan. The very language of such efforts, bringing the river back to life, restoring it, or returning it to a previous state, suggests that the river indeed had been unrivered, that human deeds had undone its nature, but also that human activity can undo the undoing. Both aspects of the river's modern history make me wonder, does nature really go anywhere when we arm ourselves with pitchforks to drive it away? What makes a river and what can render it a river no longer? Does a culture ordain have the last word on when a river is not a river? In other words, one of the more provocative ingredients currently afloat in the odoriferous waters of the LA River is paradox. Perhaps better than any other stream in the United States, the LA makes plain that an obtuse question worthy of Heraclitus, when is a river not a river, is more than a philosophical conundrum. For the ancient Greek thinker, flowing water was an opportunity to consider a fundamental paradox of reality. Things constantly change, including human beings and especially our minds, even though forms seem to stay the same. Heraclitus wrote, "We step and do not step into the same rivers. We are and are not." Paradox, thinking that is taken beyond convention or orthodoxy, entails an unbelievable or even absurd contradiction that nonetheless enables a glimpse of something true. The LA River, by both being a river and by being a river not, poses a host of questions about our understanding of natural phenomena, questions about being and meaning, about what we call the environment, political and societal questions, and questions about the ecological and economic future of cities. A textual potamological approach to these questions reveals underlying paradoxes, and acknowledging these seemingly absurd contradictions might enliven our responses. In the case of LA, a fictional take on 20th century history reveals the paradox of a river that both is and is not. In the film Chinatown from 1974, writer Robert Towne and director Roman Polanski feature the play of presence and absence to reveal sinister meanings in the vexed relations of water and power. The story twists together two main threads. One that is external and thus visible, the other internal and thus concealed. The plot revolves around the discovery of their entanglement. The concealed thread comprises a perverse tale of father-daughter incest, while issues of water control constitute the external thread. In an early scene at a public meeting at City Hall regarding a proposed dam project, witnesses testified to the fact that LA is in danger of being reclaimed by the desert from which it sprang. Culture is under threat from nature. In need of water due to an extended drought, LA citizens clamor for measures that will slake the desperate city. The ensuing scene takes place on a section of the rainless LA riverbed. The film's protagonist, a private detective, watches from afar as Hollis Mulray, the chief engineer of the Department of Water and Power, carefully examines the bone-dry bottom. Towne's script makes clear what viewers of the film should see in the river. It says, "It's virtually empty. Sun blazes off its ugly concrete banks. Where the banks are earthen, they are parched and choked with weeds." to drive home the point of a so-called river composed primarily of dust and cement, the camera and detective follow the chief engineer as he makes his way down to the center of the riverbed. There, Mulray stops, turns slowly, appears to be looking at the bottom of the riverbed, or, and there's a pregnant pause in the script, or at nothing at all. Here, the story expressly signals its interest in paradox. The absence of the river is present, quite present. And the emptiness of the scene, desiccated land lined with concrete and bleached by desert sun, functions both to remind viewers of the life-giving power of water and to prefigure the power of those who can control or manage the water. Mulray is later found dead, and the circumstances of his death again feature the paradoxical play of the absence and presence of water. In the coroner's office, we hear, "Isn't this something? Middle of a drought and a water commissioner drowns. Only in L.A., the coroner says." As the scene nears an end, the coroner also informs the detective that a drunk has been found drowned in the drought-ridden L.A. River. Death by paradox. The detective eventually discovers that water appears and disappears in different sections of the river each night. The river sometimes is and sometimes is not. And this discovery leads him to the power that controls the water, which power is intimately implicated with the internal incest thread of the tale. While the historical basis for part of the plot of Chinatown is sordid enough, the tangling of the two stories in the fictional approach of Town and Polanski presents a darkling view of a perverted landscape. By revisiting the fact that a group of the city's wealthiest men, privy to inside information about the plans of the Department of Water and Power, bought up land cheaply in the San Fernando Valley and realized enormous profits on their purchases, and imaginatively weaving that fact together with myth and moral inquiry, Chinatown creates a compelling drama about nature and culture, life and death in the LA Basin, at the heart of which lies the river. Paradoxically, the river's absence is what's most present in Chinatown. The river is absent due to the unnatural acts of abominable men, and the solution to the mystery made by the interwoven stories is beyond the reach of the detective hero. That's Jack Nicholson, for those of you who haven't seen the film. Viewers of the film, however, see the limits of Jack Nicholson, see the limits of the detective's reason in fully understanding the paradoxes that point toward the truth. Perhaps the paramount paradox of Chinatown is that hope both is and is not the absence of despair. Vernon Shetley observes that although the film confines us to the detective's point of view, it constantly reminds us of the limitations of that viewpoint. We are encouraged to go beyond his limited imagination and see more clearly not only the LA past cinematically illuminated by Chinatown, but also the seemingly denatured and seamy future being engineered in the film's present. Works of art may have other forms of political impact than that of providing positive role models of political struggle, Vernon Shetley proposes, explaining that Chinatown became a rallying cry for water battles throughout California in the 1970s and 80s. The end of the film, which is rather bleak, is not necessarily the end of the story. That the name is invoked by those challenging the operations of Los Angeles' Department of Water and Power suggests that Chinatown stands for more than absence or despair. It represents rather the possibility of people rethinking the monstrous acts of a culture hell-bent on dominating nature for its own ends. Or perhaps it represents the impossibility of the ultimate success of such a monstrous project. The song of my epigraph includes the age-old apothegm, "The higher that the monkey can climb, the more he shows his tail." how might that apply to the Los Angeles River, to Chinatown, and the city's history of water and power? Maybe that shaggy buttocks we see in the sky is just culture thinking it can climb, 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 and finally leave behind nature. And maybe instead of being the end of a tale, it's after all only the tail end of a ludicrous quest, a faint chattering to be drowned out when nature comes roaring back again. History's contradictions can be solved like puzzles or mysteries by logical detectives. Fiction's paradoxes present us with another story. The history of the LA River describes a cultural framework based on a logic of culture's separation from nature in a contested relationship that required a culture's obtaining control over nature and then managing those resources. At the current end of this chronology, that is, in our present, we increasingly question the logic of control, guided by critical histories and political remediation. But insofar as those efforts belong to the same cultural framework of separation that produced the present moment, the questioning and the remediation can only go so far. It is exceedingly difficult to examine our cultural framework from within it. Our views are informed by its logic. Art, and especially fiction, by combining imagination with unaccustomed associations, is particularly adept at revealing oddities in the stories by which we live. And in some instances, these oddities take the form of paradox. While it is a commonplace that fiction can enrich history and fact with meaning through its manipulation of narrative, image, setting, character, etc., fiction's chief asset, as we confront the consequences of cultural estrangement from nature, may prove to be the facility with which it helps us come to terms with paradox. With paradox comes potential. The eminent philosopher W.V. Quine asserted that more than once in history, the discovery of paradox has been the occasion for major reconstruction at the foundations of thought. Paradox, a disruption of customary thought processes, might offer a glimpse of the truth, might help us rethink the frame or at least discover its form and influences. At the very least, paradox might open to humility by exposing a problem in the logic of hubris. But paradox itself is only a part of a process, not an end in itself, a question that leads to other questions that could very well rattle the ladder on which the monkey climbs. Perhaps paradox, properly considered, brings us back down to earth, back down to the river, where we might renew our efforts to obtain some clarity regarding our nature, some vitality in our inhabiting, some fluidity in our thinking. Paradox, paradoxically, is a way of making contact with the river by introducing a moment of intellectual distancing or displacement, a detachment from what we think we know and from the usual ways of making sense of things. Paradox opens to critical self-reflection, from which we might espy a fresher, more effective water politics.
Thank you very much, first of all, and thank you for this wonderful opportunity to bring a little bit of the interrogations or the questions that I actually ask myself in my work in far corners of the world. In other words, in Latin America, but in certain distant areas of Latin America. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit of a reflection of an interdisciplinary approach that I have to work. It's not specifically eco-criticism, as I had been introduced. And so I will just begin, and I will let you know how I'm going to frame this talk. So, brief introduction. What I'd like to highlight is that the web of phenomena, as I identified, that comprise the global water crisis, continues to gain a wider public and political attention as growing demands for fresh water have increased conflict and environmental impacts, as we all know. Good water supplies have become relatively scarcer, and hence both supply and distribution have become more valuable and politically contested. Simultaneously, policy reform to improve water management and the allocation face further scrutiny as the tensions between social equity and economic efficiency remain part of the main point of conflict in the debate. So I'd like to pause for a second about what do I mean about with this word economic efficiency. The term efficiency in general has been understood to imply a market-oriented set of criteria that promotes water management as an approach that has been dominating water policies for a number of years. And I identify this as a fairly narrow monetary value, assigning a fairly narrow monetary value to water, such as prices in the market that are ascribed to processing and distribution of water. That gives rise to contradictions when it fails to address social equity and ecological integrity, as for example in the need to have a river basin management. So within this paradigm, it emerges the private property, which is understood as an institution for allocating scarce resources, and it manifests actually as rules of governing and controlling access to that resource, not only as an institution that can be seen sort of monolithically. So the way that I'm going to actually engage with this is first I will frame the questions, then I'll provide some background, and then we'll go to case studies and some takeaways. And this way of approaching it, that is why I labeled, I put in the title political ecology. Political ecology, I view it as an opportunity, a disciplinary, to look at a case study or a place-based approach and engage with principles of social equity and ecological integrity or environmental justice. So, framing. The framing is, as I just mentioned, the debate has been sort of going around, centered on this dichotomy of social equity and efficiency, economic efficiency. But I see a different kind of less familiar tension that is actually between the complex nature of water and simplifying epistemologies that distort this nature. In other words, coupled with this notion of efficiency, there's a set of technical approaches to water management. And in this water management, there's the limitations of these approaches to water management are the actual areas that sort of limit, in a way, the efficiency, the efficiency model itself. So there's an epistemological and a conceptual need to recognize the complexity of water. This complexity of water involves economic, social, political, cultural, and ecological. So when we treat these other components as externalities of an economically driven model, we are looking at all these other areas that actually undermine the proposed management techniques that we're actually engaging with. So what I mean to say, before we go to the case studies, is that water, as being complex and multidimensional, it's also, in a way, self-organizing. And self-organizing in nature means that it's part of a complex system. It involves people, and it is rooted in culture. And I will go back to that. So in a way, what I'm going to be proposing is that this complexity is what drives us to look at management as a subset of what we need to understand as governance. And in governance, I mean not strictly government, but multiple actors that are involved in governance and the multiple shapes that governance actually takes nowadays, which is transforming from this sort of uniform way that we tended to address government in a way. So case studies, 2 case studies, Canary Islands and Rapa Nui or Easter Island. Why these case studies? Canary Islands and Rapa Nui are both volcanic in nature. They both sit on top of sort of a cushion of fresh water, an aquifer. And they have some similarities in that the water drains through this volcanic composition of the soil, and then there are some other layers underneath that really hold this water from actually mixing with the salt water of the ocean. But particular importance is that both these cases of Canary Island and Easter Island have been championed as examples where water markets have really been effective and efficient. In the case of Canary Islands, this has been carried through Spain and then eventually the World Bank. In the case of Easter Island, in the case of Chilean water markets, actually, not only they have been championed by the World Bank and lending and international lending agencies, but on top of it has been proposed as a model to be imitated. So why these 2 cases? Because until recently, in this case, through the work of an economist by the name of Federico Aguilera Klink, and in this case by the work of a geographer actually by the name of Karl Bauer, no empirical work had been done to corroborate that these models of water markets were as successful as they were claimed to be. So water in its multiple dimensions, I somewhat mentioned it, but on top of it, I would like to add that water has different states, and it's continuously undergoing transformations. And these transformations are both physical and they are actually social as well. In governance, I would like to also readdress it as politically complex, as having social implications, cultural implications, implications of economic growth, involving multiple actors. And in that way, rooted in culture. And I go back to rooting it in culture, partly because I do cultural studies, but also I would like to bring this notion of culture in a slightly different context that we tend to look at it. This is culture. This is a manifestation, an expression of culture. And I don't know if everybody understands what this, I could not really get a picture of the equivalent on water distribution. Because this is far easier to actually access. You see it right in the cities in Chile. For the water equivalent, you have to actually go a little bit outside of the city. And I did not do that. This is culture. This is another manifestation of culture. And why do I put this picture here? Why do I bring this picture here? Precisely to highlight that notion of management and governance. We can elaborate data, apply theories, look at solutions that are predictable, rooted in this predictability and reproducibility, potentially, of our models, and manage it very well. Yet, this is culture. This is where we really have to actually incorporate in our governing if we want this to actually be sustained. And this manifestation of culture is already changing. Not only is it what we see, but with climate change, we could probably say, well, this water is already rising. So there are phenomena that are taking place where our management of this particular area will probably be trumped over anytime soon. In other words, that fence will probably be overcome by the way that our expression, that we express our values, principles, and our culture. Let's go to Latin America. Latin America, there's yet another layer that I would like to add, which these models don't seem to necessarily address, and that is the uniformity of the notion of citizenship. Many of these models for managing water have been developed under the following or stemming from the northern hemisphere, where citizenship had some entitlements, such as access to water, access to a certain number of services. And that is not specifically the case in Latin America. And I wanted to look at some data, and I may not find it. But it's so from memory, about 45% of the population does not have access to good drinking water in Latin America. This is data from about 2 years ago. And 1 in 6 only has access to, has actually sewer facilities, or the ability to have this service added to. So this is not only a portion, this by the way is in downtown Buenos Aires. It's not only this number of population is typically considered the socially excluded, but it's also not having any kind of political entitlements. So let's just go now to, let me just move forward a little bit. Let's go to the 2 examples, Canary Islands. Canary Islands, Tenerife, in this particular case, has a water law in Spain dating from 2001 that actually considers citizens and not necessarily customers, and attempts to put the public interest ahead of the private interest. Yet, what has been part of the historic basis of the case, unequal ownership of land and water rights, human transformation of the landscape, the relationship of surface and underground water, as well as the agreements or the alleged agreements between owners and politicians tend to manifest. So this study has identified 2 particular aspects of the institution. One that is visible, that is instrumental, that is what everybody uses to assess the success of this institutional arrangement. And the other one is a different kind of arrangement that is less visible, where decisions are made behind closed doors, where there is no real participation of the community in the decision making, and which this scholar in particular that is a champion for this, for his new visions of the new culture of water, identifies as a deterioration of the democratic process. Chile. Chile, and I use specifically the term neoliberal model in Chile, I know that the term neoliberal, it's a bit of a catch-all kind of terminology nowadays, but I use it specifically for a policy approach that was done in Chile. This policy approach was basically evolved from the military government and its civilian advisors following the coup in 1973, which was not only intended to erase egalitarian sort of policies and their supporters, as we probably all know that it did. It also institutionalized a particular economic model. And what I would like to point out as this policy approach is that this constitution that was finally sort of constructed in 1980, not constructed, I'm liking some English words here, Spanish would be a lot easier. In 1980 is the constitution that is still active? No, it's still in place today. It's still in place today. And so is the Water Code. The Water Code is from 1981, and that Water Code, despite the various amendments it's had, is still enacted today with these principles behind it. And what are these principles? Minimizing the state discretionary power of production and distribution, maximizing economic efficiency, and liberalizing trade. So what that does, in a way, it translates into some institutional fractioning. How was this realized? Through privatization of economic activities. So it is a textbook model of privatization. and limits to the regulations that can be imposed on that, and a strong freedom in pricing. So how does this translate into the Water Code? Strong private property rights, broad economic freedoms, and weak government regulations over the Water Code. So let me remind you of culture, okay, as how it may intersect with this model that is throughout the entire territory. And I may add, it actually is heavily undermining the current environmental law passed a year and a half ago in Chile, because this environmental law, even though it has wonderful language and wonderful principles, it is very hard to implement because of this institutional fractioning that has evolved from this time in this constitution. So let's return a little bit to this epistemological tensions. Primarily, what I'd like to point out is water institutions. What this demonstrates is water institutions are not apolitical and neutral. They presently lack transparency, and private property conceived as, I'm not going to go into details, but anyway, conceived as basically discrete units that can be assigned to an owner that then chooses, or not chooses, but has the ability to exclude others from it, basically is at odds with the multiple aspects of water. So Easter Island, and I will be brief because I have only a few minutes left. Yes. So Easter Island, that is the center of my research, actually. Easter Island, I won't go through the history, but a few points are important. It was annexed to Chile in 1988. Prior to annexation, actually, the population almost was completely decimated at the hands of the slave trade, the Pacific slave trade. Upon annexation, it became basically a sheep ranch that was assigned to a particular corporation. The whole entire population of Easter Island, which was, and I don't know which screen to use, but was distributed by tradition along or throughout the island, was encroached into Hangaroa, a city that was actually walled. So the people were walled in, these people that were used to living all over the island were walled in here, and the rest of the island was at the hands of a foreign corporation that actually used it as a sheep ranch. When that changed, it went to ownership of the military. So today, only 18% of the land is actually the hands of the original people. So that's a little bit of background of history. Privatization. I need to summarize the next few slides quite together. So the most recent study about the hydrological resources of the island that actually has come out this past year from University of Chile is incredibly well researched, very well done, in that it corroborates a lot of the observations I had on the island about the imminent risk of the water resource. And if the water resource disappears, it's going to be considerably a problem because of the distance of this island. In particular, why do I put this slide up? I'm not going to go into all the details, point and diffuse sources of basically contamination of this water. Particularly, one of the main problems is waste disposal. No waste can leave the island. No recycling can leave the island at the time because of the dengue vectors. That's policy from the continent. Yet, Land Chile has no restrictions as to choosing how many flights they actually, well, there are some restrictions that come from the continent, but there is nothing on the island, no institution on the island that can restrict the number of flights coming into the island. On top of it, it's advertising as relaxed and dramatic beaches. There are no beaches. There's only one beach, and it's in an incredibly fragile state. And you cannot walk or hike around the volcanoes because they are in a state of almost collapse. So the conflict with a private entity in this case is quite noticeable because there's been an increase of 17,000 approximately in 2005 transient individuals that visit the island to about 60,000 in 2 years. Can I have 2 more minutes? Thank you. So takeaways. So what I wanted to, the pictures that I would like to show is that there is a culture of water. There's a very strong culture of water, of the population that is not the transient population. The highest risk of this water is at the hands of the transient, of population that comes in and out. And there's another market, the market of bottled water, that has developed. And imagine, this is a very warm weather. A tourist that goes on a hike, you'll take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bottles a day. That plastic, yes, can be recycled, but it goes eventually into the dump because there's no landfill. So the lixiviate from there is creeping right into the water source. And there is no real institutional arrangement to manage this differentially. This is the crater, and these are actually practices, agricultural practices that are traditional, that conserve moisture, and these are some of the signs on the island that the practice of water was in place. So very quickly, what are the takeaways? The takeaways for me are systems thinking. Think of it systemically. And what does that mean? We can think about ecosystems systemically. What does it impact, and the impact is received? We can think about community systemically. It comes from thinking about the earth systems, but how about thinking about governance systemically? And furthermore, is governance management being a subset of governance, and governance being multi-actor. And we'll not get into the culture of water, but I would just like to end by saying that water is interconnected to ecosystems, to climate, to food, to culture. And perhaps what we could reproduce is sustainability as the principle that will take us forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you for those excellent and interesting talks. We now have time for questions. I think normally now I'm sort of asked to give a comment, but I've learned in my years of teaching that usually the audience has more intelligent and useful things to say than I do. So I'm going to open it up to questions. I would invite our panelists to please come, three of them to come stand up here. And I will run this by calling out names or calling on hands, taking questions one by one. Excellent. We have a mobile mic. Perfect. So if we can... Hello? Okay. So if we could open it up to any questions. First question in the back.
I was really excited by Pushpa's discussion because I spent a year in Gujarat doing research. And I sort of know a lot about the history of water conflicts. And I thought one really interesting thing that didn't get mentioned was the Southern project, how part of the way that the government talked about legitimizing that was through putting those people to work. Right? The people who had been were going to be pushed off the land, they would have the job of creating beautiful things for the city. So I thought that was really quintessential for how the government deals with this kind of displacement, was to say, well, in the meantime, you could have a job until it's finished. Right. And then happen without that. So I appreciate the sort of holistic idea of what water resources are and the problems with it.
Thank you.
I have a question for T.S. To what extent do you think the paradoxes in the LA River are specific to LA, and to what extent, or do they reflect intellectual traditions in the United States for looking at nature and development?
I think the latter.
Yeah.
LA,
Say a little more.
well, LA presents a particularly striking example, I think, partly because of that history of paving and reworking the land, and the ways in which conceptually the river is completely lost at certain times to many people. In fact, in LA today, you can find many people who say, we have a river in LA? It's just gone. So that one of the things that I'm thinking about doing with this literary project is using it to, as I said to others, daylight the LA River. Daylighting usually means taking a river that's been covered over by concrete structures already and completely gone underground somewhere, or under buildings usually, and then taking down those structures and exposing the river to daylight. The LA River is exposed to daylight, lots of it, it's in Southern California, but conceptually, it's not exposed to daylight. So in some ways, I think it is representative of American rivers. I'd like to head closer to home to Cleveland, where I'm working now, and thinking about the Cuyahoga River, which is a similar history, but not so dramatic. So LA is a particularly dramatic example.
More fiery.
Yes, exactly. Very fiery at times.
Excellent. From this side.
Can I just ask, when you respond, you look at you talk at the mic, because you talk to the mic because we're live streaming the
Okay.
whole event.
Should I say that all again then?
You know, having grown up in LA, the project of destroying and denaturing the Los Angeles River and the 18,000 acres of wetlands that were associated with that river to create the harbor is a really important one. The sense is that in 1920, 1930, there was an opportunity to actually change the direction with Olmsted and Bartholomew's project, which, if students aren't aware, I mean, it's the heart of good regional, bioregional planning. Olmsted and Bartholomew, involved in a lot of great sort of city developments and parks. I wonder if you could expand on perhaps that paradox, and that is, to let the river go wide was the heart of the Olmsted and Bartholomew plan, to keep the floodplain a floodplain.
Well, and that's coming back. And in some of the projects regarding the river now, that is an interest of some people. Part of the problem with that is that the floods in the late 30s were terrible for development, for the things that had been put in place in the century before that. So right now the river is designed to move water as rapidly as possible from the mountains to the ocean. And it's not supposed to have contact with people or be something thought of as a river. And many of the projects are trying to tackle that and tear out concrete, put in different kinds of beautification projects. Actually, Pushpa, some of the work on the banks are trying to make this a place that's amenable to people, and they'll want to come down and they'll be proud of their river, and then that can go on to other ideas of nature. So that one, I don't know about the paradox there. The Olmsted Plan does actually come back into play these days for people thinking about revitalization projects, and I would like to, I don't know if some of the people that I've been speaking with and working with out in LA are reluctant to go for the entire let's let the river go wild sort of thing, and there's maybe that's just too complex for some of us. But maybe we just need more imagination. And that's kind of where Bill finished up last night. He said that we're only limited by our imagination in our approach to these solutions. I think that our imagination, however, is also limited by our logic and our experiences and things of that kind. So we need a kind of critical self-reflection to go along with that imagination.
I guess that my question pertains a little bit more to the first two presentations. And I found it really interesting how development seems to be influenced by this idea of absence or presence of water and the relationship between power and access. But I was wondering if you guys could speak a little bit to pollution and issues of water quality and how that may affect the issue.
You want that one?
Go for it.
You go ahead, please.
Sorry, it was for anyone, or I wasn't
Yeah,
sure?
I mean, I thought it was potentially more related to your topic.
Yeah, I mean, we do have a lot of projects and programs that are really about, dealing with water pollution issues. And a lot of it is related to issues around climate change, but also around, just in terms of attitudes towards how to work with water, how to deal with water. So it's again tied back to some of those social cultural issues that I talked about. But what I worry about is often when you talk about pollution, even the Narmada waters, for example. I mean, there was a period of time for about a week, the waters were coming in completely muddied, and people were complaining about the quality of water in those and why we need to improve upon the treatment of these waters and things like that. And I think those kinds of questions, like I see, because I don't come from that environment perspective, I look at it really in terms of how people deal with some of these issues, their attitudes towards it, the perceptions, the kinds of things we need to work on them from bottom up to change it, not just the idea that water needs to be purified and then we are able to provide this, which again then brings in, the whole concept of economics and power into that. So that's how I look at some of these issues, and we deal a lot with it when we are working with populations in the slums and in the rural areas.
My question is as well. Okay, yeah. I just wanted to make a comment about this in the particular case of Easter Island because it's quite interesting. That there are concerns about the water quality, yet the local population, the actual Rapa Nui and relatives, because they're not just Rapa Nui alone, that the local population that resides annually of Iyer on the island has already engaged prior to the institution coming up with any kind of recommendations with some practices that are sort of alterations or resemble traditional practices that come down ancestrally to them. There are several locations on the island that are marked on the rock as areas that the Rapa Nui caved to the rock 500 years ago to collect rainwater. And they're marked with specific symbols that are quite interesting because they're basically the symbol of virginity, of virginity in a way, which is also what's on the famous hats of those of the Moai. I won't get into that, but that is quite interesting. And those sites are not accessible by tourists. In other words, for me to actually be able to get to see these sites, I had to learn to listen. I had to be invited in, and I had to be labeled by a particular clan as you're a spy for the Rapa Nui outside of this island. I wasn't a researcher from any institution, in particular not in the Northern Hemisphere. So, and the other one is they're already collecting rainwater. There's already practices of rainwater collection anticipating. So it's really the tourist population that keeps growing, and it's transient that is at risk.
This is a question from Maria. Maria, you mentioned the tension between management and governance. I imagine that what you were trying to emphasize was that management, the idea of there was a correct technical way to manage the resources, while governance allows for more open discussion, involvement of different stakeholders, a more political process. Mm-hmm. But this is what I understood from your presentation. But I wanted to, if you could elaborate a little more about how that tension you see it specifically in the cases that you have been addressed.
Okay, I will actually bring you forth with an example, a concrete example, because I think usually that is a lot easier than theorizing. The concrete example is this study I just cited, which was done at the University of Chile, which is the only one that actually has a presence in terms of research that is not archaeological, anthropological on the island, in Easter Island. This study is not only the most thorough study I have seen on hydrological resources about the island, but it also proposes a plan of management to the island. So you read through about 2/3 of it, and it is incredibly progressive thinking and very thoroughly done. You get to the end of the proposal and you realize that it's following World Bank strategies for management. Yet, the other problem, not yet, but moreover, what it's doing is reproducing an urban metabolic change of water. The metabolic change of water that usually typically goes on in urban settings for the island. So in other words, there is the contextual component for the management is missing. The cultural component is missing, which is typically missing there. So that is why I say a subset of governance makes sense. But if you do not address it in its complexity, and then it most likely will ultimately fail.
I have a question for TS.
Hi.
I was thinking about other movies that depict the LA River, specifically Grease and Drive recently.
Yeah.
In which people kind of bring the LA car culture to the LA River. I was wondering if that has any effect on the public discourse around the LA River, in that, not that it's a heritage site, but that it's celebrated in the sense that it's a river that was turned into a driving circus. Does that affect discourse around the river?
Yes. Yeah, and actually those are two interesting examples. Greece is in some ways the older model before revitalization and interest in the river as a river gets going. So in Greece, you use the bed of the river basically for a car chase or a race of some kind, and it emphasizes the concrete over the. You don't see any water in those sections. I think there might be some on the outside. Most of those are taken, by the way, I think near the 6th Street Bridge, and you can still walk out there, and there's always a filming crew in LA right by the 6th Street Bridge taking shots of things. Drive is interesting because it shows the river in a kind of recognizably natural light, and it's seen. The river is a getaway from the car culture of LA. The car gets you to it, but then you get out of the car actually, and you go out into in the foliage and the shade, and it's this lovely scene in an otherwise brutal movie. So in some ways, that itself signals a change in film's interest in what the river might mean. There's also a really beautiful movie, Eric Nazarian, I think, called The Blue Hour, that features several scenes that unfold along the river and give it in a different light. Some of them are not that happy, but it gives the river its own attention rather than just a setting for car chases and battles. If you have any TV show that was filmed in LA starting in the 60s, maybe in the 50s on, has a car chase down the river. It's really quite something to see.
Okay. Yes. Hi, my question regards the Narmada Dam. And I'm just curious if the work in response that Arundhati Roy has written about and advocated for the tribals, if that has deterred any further development on the large dam scale in India. And also in response to those displaced for the building of the dam, are there any reparations offered? And if so, have they been effective?
So Arundhati Roy came a little bit later on this scene. It was first the Narmada Bachao Andolan, which was led by Medha Patkar and her group. And at the time that I was working in India, we were associated very closely with the Narmada Bachao Andolan, and I knew of a lot of things that were happening on the ground. And primary among them was the issue of reparations and rehabilitation of many of the tribals along on the coast. And I think Arundhati Roy brought, in a sense, I would say, I love her work, and I think, she's very powerful. She's able to convey in a very powerful way, and I think she brought in new blood in terms of, highlighting the issues all over again, especially because of the height of the dam that was constantly being increased. And this was coming from the Supreme Court that was allowing for it. The last time the Supreme Court gave their judgment, they said that unless the government pays attention to all the reparations and the rehabilitation that is taking place, and unless that's satisfactorily handled, we would not give more permission for the height of the dam to be increased. But, the Gujarat government has continued to persist on that. So that's where it is at this time. But there's been a lot of small success along the way for the Narmada Bachao Andolan and through Arundhati Roy in terms of highlighting some of the issues of the tribals. But it hasn't been significantly to the level where really we could say, yes, there's been compensation enough, or, in some ways the tribals have been rehabilitated because of this dam.
Hi, I want to go back to Chinatown for a second. It's one of my favorite films, and
Really?
Yeah, and I forget the name of the screenwriter. I think you mentioned his name, but I'm always amazed at how well that film captures the political culture of sort of a water bureaucracy, especially the one in Southern California. And so I wondered I realized you weren't talking about film history, but did they do research? It's almost like an insider's view. And then the flip side of that, what was the reaction? You mentioned a little bit that it's kind of helped shape water politics and reaction on the part of the public and things like that. Was there a reaction, and was there sort of a backlash? Say, like, how did you guys know this stuff?
I think, well, and there actually is some contestation about the history on which the film is based. They've flattened things out a little bit. I'm not too clear on the reception of the film. Do you know anything about that? I mean, except for the fact that it did get movements going in certain of the other water battles that were happening, excuse me, throughout California in the 70s and 80s. One of the interesting things to me about the history of politics and the kind of Byzantine structure of LA politics plays out today in the governance of the river. So I mentioned that the EPA and the Corps of Engineers have had a long-running battle about the status of the river, whether the river is a river. And it was an employee of the Corps who actually talked a couple other people into first kayaking and canoeing the length of the river to prove that it was navigable. And she got fired for that. But then that started in motion a whole set of different things. And one of the things that these people who kayaked the river benefited from was the Byzantine structure, because they were able to duck under the radar of various entities by saying, oh yeah, so-and-so said it was okay, or so-and-so said it was okay. But otherwise, you've got so many different municipalities. You've got the city of LA and the county of LA. You've got the state of California. You've got federal oversight. And it's just a mess, and it's really difficult to get things done. In 2000... Well, just this year, another film has been released called Rock the Boat, which is a documentary of this first navigation of the LA River, and I think it's widely distributed now. It's really fun to look at, but you get a sense of how strange the political culture is still and why it's hard to get things done. One of the interesting things about LA too is that the Friends of the Los Angeles River, one of the main groups currently advocating for revitalization, was more or less started by a poet, Lewis McAdams, and it began as a performance project many, many years ago. And Lewis and a couple other artists went down to the river and symbolically cut some of the chain link fence, and then entered the river, had access to the river in order to bring attention to it, basically. And that political act has become an organizing motif, I think, for Friends of the LA River. And Lewis himself, though, he's a poet, and he's caught between trying to deal with all of these different political entities and different corporate groups, and it's not easy.
This is a question to both Pushpa and Maria. You both mentioned that it's important to take culture into consideration when it comes to these water management programs. But can you give some practical examples of how this could be achieved, for example, in Gujarat or in the Eastern Islands? And is it possible to achieve successful programs like this with international involvement, or is it necessary that these initiatives come from the local people themselves?
So, in terms of why I was speaking so much about culture is, there's so much tradition tied around to the issue of water access and water management, what you really use water for. And I include in culture or, social, cultural aspect of water, the whole concept of, say, religion and caste, and caste is a very important one in terms of who has access to water. The untouchable or the Dalit communities have traditionally never had that access source to water. I mean, they could even today be killed if they went close to a well or to a water source that belonged to somebody from the higher caste. So, there's still a lot of barriers that we face in terms of the way our society is structured, in terms of some of the traditions we follow to ensuring equality in terms of access to water, which is why I think that component of bringing culture into it as really in trying to understand how it plays out in the local context, not to say that we have to work with that same culture, which is why I said just as we are politically a very divided society or economically a very divided society, we are culturally very divided too, so there needs to be some work that has to be done. There's a very interesting group in Gujarat called the Navsarjan group, and they do a lot of work with the Dalit communities. That's primarily what they work in. And one of the aspects of what they've picked up is with regard to water. How can we ensure that everybody has the same access to water? How can we ensure that everybody, that in a particular village, we're not talking about these notions of purity and pollution, which leaves some people out, or some of the communities out of it. So they started a project in which the head of Navsarjan actually went into these villages and ensured that he would drink water or he would drink tea from the same cup that was kept aside for a member of the Dalit community. And in ensuring that other people follow the practice of not saying we had separate cups for different people, he made sure that you broke that taboo of saying water cannot be shared, but actually that it's something that we all equally have it. So it's tied very much to the caste system, but it was in a way helping people realize that we are going to break some of our traditions around the caste system, and then at the same time ensure that everybody has the right to this basic need in society. So I have other examples as well, but it's like working with culture in order to change it and not letting culture be the divisive mechanism to them.
So to illustrate what I mean by culture and a diverse, I will mention first, before you start, I'll mention Canary Islands, actually, because the notion of culture in the case of Canary Islands actually has translated into a new culture of water that has been adopted by the European Declaration of a New Culture of Water. So there is a larger consensus that actually is looking at a very progressive way of understanding water governance, as I would call it, and not strictly management. And it has three pillars that actually it's supported by. One is to actually try to reconceive the economy within the ecosystem limits or the carrying capacity of an ecosystem. Additionally, to change the mentality of people, where it's not only expert knows best, I, a participant, can contribute to how my community will manage water and will manage resources. And in many cases, the local knowledge can actually alter things in a much more positive way than the reproduction of a model that comes from somewhere else. And the third component is strengthening the democratic notion of participation. So those are the actual principles behind this culture of water that has been consensually really now taken into the Declaration of New Culture of Water in Europe, that is also being exported somewhat to Latin America. In the case of Easter Island, with the institutional framework, I see that as a much more difficult and a very different arrangement where culture once again plays a very important role. In order to advance any of their conceived rights, Rapa Nui people are actually looking at, in education, they're looking at New Zealand, they're looking at Tahiti. When it comes to health, they're actually connected with Canada and with Germany. So it is a much more complex basically network where actors are not what you would anticipate. And there is a lot of rich knowledge on how to deal with water, how to use water in a very sustainable manner in the many areas that water many areas that water interacts with in the local community. Yet they're absolutely invisible when it comes to systems that is set up politically for participation. So there's a lot of lack of communication, lack of discussion, and often in the consensual narratives, as I would put it, of international agreements or scholarly work, the language is either so complex or often ambiguous that the public has a very difficult time understanding exactly, or has a more difficult time engaging with it, let's put it that way. Does that make sense?
I have a question, and it's structural more for the Los Angeles River. Having spent a lot of time traveling in California and having lived there for several years, if water is scarce, I'm puzzled as to why water is transported for hundreds of miles in concrete viaducts that are open. My question is, what must be the evaporation rate from the source, the Colorado or Hetchy Hetchy or any of the other dams, by the time it gets where it's needed?
The evaporation rate is very high. I don't have the exact figures. Anybody know? I'm 20%. Yeah, there are many who agree with you. Well, I think it's probably it was a relatively easier way to build them, for one thing. But why are they kept that way? It's probably a matter of economic efficiency and things of that kind as well. But it's also that coupled with the idea that much water is moved as quickly as possible as it can be from the mountains out to the ocean without making use of it. Much fresh water that is a problem. So both of those are where logic has broken down to a certain extent, and some better thinking is necessary. Yeah.
Well, there are 1,200 irrigation systems in California that have literally redirected the watersheds of the state, and it represents 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah.
So just pushing that water around, transporting it, is a major contributor to climate change.
Yeah.
So there's the greatest one.
Yes.
Can I add something? When we talk about scarcity, there is physical scarcity, but there's also socially constructed scarcity. So we may have to differentiate between those two.
Hi, my name's Jake. My question is also about the LA River. And I was just wondering if the transition from the LA River to being navigable has changed any land use policy. Just because I think in California, in a navigable river, the land up to the high water mark is public. Is that correct?
I think so, yeah. It has changed things. Things are changing relatively steadily, might be overstating it. But so that kayaking program that began a couple years ago, and it was just in one section near the Sepulveda Basin, that's now being expanded in coming years to parts in the Glendale Narrows, so a little bit further downriver. So that kind of use and access is increasing. It's still the case, though, that a good portion of the river is chained off, and you can't go down there because of liability issues. Basically, if you get caught in a storm, you're gone, and that's a big problem. So there are all kinds of projects currently underway for park space and for linking the bike trail that runs through much of LA County right now, and they're connecting that to eventually run the length of the 50-some miles of the LA River. And there's other park space, and then they're also working with, there's a kind of momentum building between various groups that are operating under the idea that we can develop still, but we can develop more wisely in ways that don't turn industry and municipal backs to the river, that make more sense of it. So it's happening, but it's not going to be really that fast, I think.
I have a question about your preliminary studies of the Cuyahoga River. Growing up in Akron, I have mostly experienced the Cuyahoga River in the reverberations of the fire catastrophe, and all the emphasis is on cleanup and all the progress that has been made there. And I was just curious if you think that this is a successful example of this clash of culture and the environment, or if this is possibly what you're talking about in a revitalization of the LA River. How do you think these two compare?
That's a good question. The Cuyahoga River is another complex matter, though. It's a long river. Its mouth is in Cleveland, and it's a big U shape like this. And at least half of the river is actually quite pretty, and it looks recognizably like a river. The parts closer to Cleveland are more urban and developed, and there are groups who have submitted proposals for restoration projects, and this is again where the kind of political clutter of different entities gets in the way of these things going forward. So there's some work that's being done now to make the Cuyahoga even more of a kind of freshwater focus, or a place that people would want to go to. It involves bank restoration and working on habitat renewal and things of that kind. And there are there's too many steps for firms to get involved, it seems like, because of the different political entities that are involved again. I don't know. I think that it is similar to LA. All rivers are complex. Let me just say that. All rivers are really complex things, and that's one of the things that fascinates me about them. One of the writers on the LA River, Jenny Price, she takes people to the confluence of Arroyo Seco and the LA River, and she says this is an American narrative vortex. And a vortex is one of those weird things where a lot of different elements and ideas and facts come together and they swirl around and they make tornadoes and things like that. That's what a vortex is. She says that vortex is something that's bringing all of these different kinds of things together. But with a vortex, you also get the possibility of a really different vision of the world. So there's a messiness to it. There is a heightened complexity, but there is also a possibility for other ways of thinking. And so the Cuyahoga, I think, is in a similar shape. I need to spend much more time on that one, though, to be able to give you a good answer to that question.
We have 2 minutes for one final question.
Thank you all so much. As I was listening to your response to that question, I was thinking about sort of the overarching theme for this panel session and how you have each spoken about discourses of control and ways in which water has been used to sort of divide and conquer, and thinking about how those who have been marginalized through those discourses have to some extent been able to reassert their identity through their relationship with the water. In some cases, it sounds like reinforcing actually the dominant discourse of this division, but also with some potential opportunities for challenging that discourse through this kind of messiness that gives a different vision of the world. And I was wondering if there are some ways in which you can speak to how those marginalized have been able to reassert their identity and challenge that division.
Yeah, it's the order. Yeah. I think there are many instances and examples of people in Gujarat who have managed to use the very same discourse that is used to control them in order to change it around, change the turn completely. Like I gave the example earlier of Dalit communities that have done it themselves, or women's groups that's come forward and actually taken over water management, in order to reassert the fact that they are the women who have to walk miles every single day, or, spend half their day going up and down just for water collection. I think there are many such positive stories of how that change is coming about at the ground level. But we are also talking in the context of a state where there is such a dominant, the power of the state is so dominant, both economically and politically, that these kinds of cultural identities, this is a government that preaches a fascist ideology of one culture, one people, one language, one religion. So this is where the biggest challenge really is at this time, is how do people make use of their very own identities that discriminates against them in order to reassert and come where they are. And it's a very tricky one, because the more you want to reassert that you're one of the marginalized, the more you want to assert and say you're a Dalit or you're a Muslim or you're a tribal and this is what you're going to stand for and here's how you're going to do it, the more you face repression on those accounts. It's very interesting. We were in Gujarat, as I said, in January, and we were talking to Muslim communities that had been displaced, like one of the pictures I showed, where all you have the drainage water and, the drinking water all mixed up, all flowing out there. And you're talking to communities that had lost family members. There were horror stories. People say it was a very emotional moment. We were talking to everyone. And at that point, there's a young gentleman that walked into the room. He was 21. He was 11 years old when the violence happened in 2002. And he had lost his father in the violence, So his mother was the one who had been telling us all the stories before he walked in. But he walked in, all very well dressed and, came and stood there. And the minute he walked into the room, there was more of a silence. In general, everybody started, being a little bit quiet. And then he opened his mouth and he said, this is all fine. Y'all come here, y'all listen to all of these stories. But let me tell you, I am a Muslim youth. I have always been marginalized. My family has always been marginalized. We have always been deprived. Now here is a government that is telling us that here's the development bandwagon. Jump onto it. It doesn't matter whether you're a Muslim, whether you're a Dalit, whether you're a tribal. Just jump onto it. The dominance is for the Hindu community. I know that. My friends are all Hindus. But I don't want to be left behind. I'm going to jump in. If this is what is going to give me water, if this is what is going to give me electricity, if this is what is going to give me the money for my family, I'm going to go with it. And so it was a shock. We took our time. It was a little hard to process because our initial reaction was, how could you, and, what does it mean, your father's death? And then he goes on to explain, and he said, you never will understand what it is to lose my father. I know what it is to lose my father. You can say all you want. You can tell me, I get it. I'm sorry for you, all of this. You don't get it. What really is, the fact is, we need to move forward. And if this is what the government is giving, I don't care the fact that I have to distinguish between me being a Muslim who has been marginalized. Right now, what I need is that development. I need to go with the flow. And I'm going to go ahead and do that. And this was a common sentiment that you saw repeatedly in many of the communities, that if it's our identity that's coming us in the way, then all right, we'll discard it. If this government is giving us this cloak of development that, seems to just take away all these different identities. But taking away those different identities means something very, very sinister, and which is what we are trying to fight. So it's a very tricky situation that we have, is where do we place our emphasis on?
So this is the intersection of identity and basically reappropriating one's identity in the light of contemporary dynamics. So when I'd like to once again bring Canary Islands to the picture, in that where identity really manifests in that particular case is that residents specifically do not identify as continental Spaniards in their narratives. And the second component that really strengthens sort of the possibilities in that case is that they perceive water as a common good, not a commodity. So that friction, that tension is very much in the public domain well, I wouldn't say the entire island, but at least in certain circles. Easter Island is a very particular, interesting case, in that case basically is a long history of resilience to maintain one's collective identity. Because when you go into the specific identities, they're very clan-like. So they're, there's a little bit of feud still between different groups, which has been claimed as the reason why privatization and the benefits of a privatized kind of system, in a way, has been so successful with the islanders, because there's been a little bit of that sort of feud. But the collective identity is what really is at the center of this resilience that occasionally is resistance, but it has not succeeded as resistance because it has basically brought death or brought further negative impacts onto them. So there is heritage, there's traditional practices that are continuously being reproduced and recreated in a way. And the reason for this, I believe, is because this is a common thread for this culture, for this collective identity of the entire of the group. I mean, of the Rapa Nui people, which are ethnically Polynesian in Chilean territory.
Thank you for your questions. We're going to have a wrap-up now and ask each of the panelists to just come and restrict themselves, each of themselves, to 2 minutes to give their final word on anything they want to say to close off. And if they could please restrict themselves to those 2 minutes, it would be greatly appreciated. And we've enjoyed everything so far. Thank you so much. And whoever wants to start, I guess we can open it up. However, the order again, I guess. Okay. Great. Thank you.
Well, I guess I probably will close as, the activist in me is probably going to close this thing. I can't close it as, in a very academic sense. But, Gujarat is not, the conflict in Gujarat or, what is happening in Gujarat right now is not something that I find that many people are aware of. And I go to audiences where sometimes people seem to know what's happening and sometimes people have absolutely no clue about what is going on in Gujarat. And what is going on in Gujarat is really very, very frightening in that sense. So my take on this is, last year I taught a class on water and conflict, and you were in that class. And there's always this tendency when we talk about something like this to find that answer, find the solution, the way to solve this problem. And if only we would privatize the water, if only we would charge people, we'd make sure that they don't waste the water, and they don't. Oh, no, we shouldn't be privatizing water. It's a basic human need, and it's a human right to access to water, so we should not be privatizing. And if we didn't privatize, then we ensured equality. Or, if only we got rid of the caste system, then, it would look very different, and so on and so forth. There's always something coming to say, if only we could do this, and somehow the focus is always on we in Gujarat who need to do something about this. But I want to twist it around and say, at least in the past month or so, and it's been going on for a while, but there are academic institutions in the United States, and I'm not going to name them, but you guys will find out if you Google it, but there are academic institutions in the United States and it involves Indian diaspora, so, no taking away that blame there, that look at Gujarat and say, here's a model of development that needs to be replicated. This is a man that's marketed development to an extent where it has become a model, not just in the country, but outside of the country. And I think the onus is on us in some ways to really look deeper into some of these issues that is in a place like Gujarat. And I'm sure Gujarat is not unique. There are other places, where we jump so quickly to look at what is out there and just make sure we're talking about, access to water or, water pollution. And we just go in that direction. And I think looking at layers and layers of how complex these situations are might be, what I am talking about in terms of holistic approach to ensuring equality in terms of access to water for all.
Kat, your question made me think of other questions. And I don't know if you noticed, I like questions, but I can't answer them. So I like to think about questions, and I like to figure out where things are going. And in some ways, that's personal. And in some ways, it comes with the territory of being a literary scholar or somebody who's involved in the humanities, where for us, questions are what we can offer. We don't really offer answers. We can't give you the truth or something like that, but we can help people pursue it, I guess, the way it works for me. So as I was thinking about your question, and I was thinking about my questions and what I think about questions, it put me in mind of a poem called The Concrete River, a really powerful poem by Luis J. Rodriguez. And in this poem, two teenage boys go down to a river like the LA River. I think it was actually the San Gabriel, I can't remember now, but they go down to a concrete river to get high, and they take some spray paint and they spray that into a bag, and you inhale that, and you get buzzed. And as the speaker of the poem is getting high, he repeats on several occasions the phrase "home for now," and he's having these visions of belonging to the world, but it's spray paint induced. It's this high. And he actually begins to die. His heart stops from this drug, and his friend has to revive him. And as he's coming back, he's lost his home, in a way, that home that he was imagining through his drug-induced state. So home for now, that temporary belonging, is gone. And to me, that poem is not offering an answer to problems. It doesn't say go get high or anything like that, or go down to the concrete river. It's asking questions about home and where people belong and who belongs where, and And that's the question that I want to keep asking myself and try to help others figure out.
Well, and actually, the teacher in me will actually close. And we tend to be used to political discourses being very polarized, bit dichotomous. We are used to compartmentalizing knowledge along disciplines, and I study literature. I'm a former biologist. What business do I have at looking at the Chilean Constitution and understanding culture through that Constitution? So many of the things I've said, I'm sure that from a disciplinary perspective of economics or a disciplinary perspective of political science will be considered weak. Yet complexity is what we really are facing. So don't be afraid to break those boundaries, to really look at complex systems, to really look at interactions, ask questions, and follow, like Tim Iyer said a few months ago, follow your heart.
So we're going to break now for about 20 minutes, and we'll start at 2:45 sharp. Thank you.